So I want to welcome Dylan Dobson, and she is from the Toronto Humane Society. She is going to speak to us on the violence link, addressing the intersection of animal abuse as it relates to intimate partner violence in older adult populations. Just to give you a little background of Dylan, Dylan is a registered social worker with nearly 20 years of professional experience in community mental health, supporting individuals experiencing homelessness and survivors of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Her practice is grounded in ethical, trauma informed social work and focuses on integrating human and animal well being in interdisciplinary settings. Sorry. Um, Dylan holds leadership roles within professional organizations, including serving as vice president of the International Association of Veterinarian Social Work, and has received provincial recognition for her contributions to the profession of social work. So, welcome, Dylan, to giving us more insight around this. We met in Toronto at the Gender Based Violence Conference, and I thought, I need to talk with you because we haven't talked about this intersection, and we know how close and dear pets are to everyone, but often to older adults may not leave abusive situations because of pets. So, I really welcome the opportunity to learn more from you and your work that you're doing at the Humane Society and just giving us some knowledge around that linkage. So I'll turn it over to you to share your screen.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be here today and so much critical learning. Thank you to all the presenters thus far. Can you see my screen? Have I succeeded?
Yes, yes, you have.
Fabulous. Okay, good. Yes, thank you, Ontario Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, for hosting me today and for sharing on perhaps a less traditional topic. So grateful for this opportunity. And my hope is that it's going to spark some future conversations, some thoughts, and perhaps some action, ideally along the way. Okay, yes, thank you for that generous introduction. My name is Dylan, and since childhood, I've really had a passion for learning about and observing and witnessing the healing power of animals, both in my own life and then, when I sort of moved into my career as a social worker. And it has been an absolute privilege to be able to witness the incredible ways that firsthand that animals can provide comfort and healing to the clients that have kindly shared their lives with me. I am really proud to be coming from Toronto Humane Society. As Ryan said, I started in human shelters, and I do have to clarify that now because now I'm in an animal shelter. And so shelters mean different things to different people depending on what your vantage point is. And so my focus really now is on strengthening the human-animal bond and creating programs and initiatives that support both people and animals, particularly for members of our community who face intersectional marginalization, which impacts significantly on a variety of areas of their lives, including the ability to care for their pets. And so everything that I'm going to share today is coming from that lens, but also the other lenses that people have been so kind to share with me over the years. You will see on my screen that is a drawing. I wish I knew how old I was, but I stumbled upon it a couple of years ago, and you can see my little dog in the bottom of the picture. He was actually a really big dog, so I mean, I think proportions were a little bit tough for me when I was drawing, so I was of that age anyway. But you can see that just as critical as, any other member of my immediate family was, the dog needed to be in that photo as well. It's that sort of says that, I've had the blessing of being able to grow up and learn from animals around me. You will hear today that I might use the word pet or companion animal somewhat interchangeably. Companion animal is really increasingly being used instead of pet. And this is to respectfully refer to non-human animals and how we purposefully choose to live and keep company with them. But for brevity, I might choose to use those words, as I said, interchangeably. One thing that I do want to share, and thank you so much for the presenters that have shared their land acknowledgement and to the organization and the conference today. But one thing that I wanted to add as well, when we think about our relationship with environment and animals, it's really critical to note in considering truth and reconciliation that we're upon to reflect on the impact of colonialism, not only on people, but again, to animals and our ecosystems. And so I share this screen really intentionally, and I know it's a lot of very small words. I'm happy to share my PowerPoint afterwards, but really critical to appreciate that colonialism has entirely reconfigured the categorization of and the relationships between the land's life forms. We know that through colonialism, new species were introduced. This resulted in the endangerment and extinctions of other species that were already here. It brought the exploitation of animals for economic gain to this continent for the very first time. It undermined indigenous peoples' relationships with animals, and we know that this has led to the loss of traditional ecological knowledge. We know that it's contributed to land destruction, animal displacement. And when we think about animals, and it's important to ground us for today's conversation, when we think about animals, we also have to recognize that husbandry or the supplies and the care that we provide to animals, many of our care practices are based on Western ideals that came out of colonialism, right? And sort of this idea of paternalistic ideas of how we engage with other beings, human and non-human. And so it's really critical to think about the wide-reaching ways in which reconciliation needs to occur. And I just want to share
Right.
this beautiful,
Dylan, it's Marta. Could I ask you just to slow down just a little bit?
no trouble. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for that prompt. I'm a quick talker. I'm really anxious to get through a lot of material today, but I appreciate that prompt. Yes.
Thank
Um, Yes, you'll see the artwork that is on the screen. And this was commissioned from an artist named Mo Thunder. And they are a non-binary, neurodivergent, multidisciplinary artist who is Haudenosaunee, French Canadian, and Anishinaabe. And through their art, they commissioned this piece for us at Toronto Humane Society. And it's a visual story reflecting their lived experiences and personal healing rather. And so it aligns with our focus on connection and reconciliation for today. So appreciating Mo's contribution to our learning in our industry and my subsequent sharing with you all today. Okay, so today's session, we're going to talk about the human-animal bond in general. We are going to also sort of move into specifically how animal abuse can intersect with animal abuse. And I know for some at this conference, this connection may not be something that you've considered before, and that is totally okay. That's why we're here today, and so glad to be here and honored to be here. We're really enthusiastic to be able to introduce the concept or the framework of the violence link. And this really explores how animal cruelty can be a red flag for other forms of abuse that might be happening within a home. And sort of the idea that violence and neglect towards animals more often than not coexists alongside other forms of violence or coercive control or neglect that might be occurring. And so it gives us this broader lens for noticing patterns of risk rather than focusing on single issues that might arise. We're going to talk about screening opportunities. So really wanting to make sure that I'm leaving you with some things that you can implement today, or hopefully not today. Hopefully you get to take the rest of today to just decompensate, to ingest everything that you've learned today, but maybe tomorrow if you're back at it working with clients. And wanting to make sure that I'm leaving you with some information around assessment and how you can plan and implement work, sort of looking at full families, including both human and non-human species. And it's really those everyday moments where questions about pets can come up in important conversations. What I do want to say right now is that it doesn't mean that having this conversation, you're expected to be an animal welfare expert or an animal care expert. It's really just about noticing changes, asking gentle questions, and recognizing when concerns about a pet may also signal risks that might be happening to or around or an older adult that you might be engaging with. And we're going to talk about a little bit about collaborative preventative strategies. We know today, I'm hearing over and over about the critical nature of collaboration, and we know that violence doesn't happen in silos. And so prevention and early intervention also do not happen in silos. And so the issue of violence sits between and betwixt our systems, right? So elder care and support services, violence prevention, animal welfare, housing, community supports, the legal system. We all sort of are blessed to be able to come together. And so we're going to consider how we can work together across sectors, really to create a safer and more holistic responses, and elevating the safety within our communities. And then if we have time, I have a little exercise for reflection and questions and answers. So like I said, it's a tall order. Um, to begin, we're going to briefly explore the historical relationship between humans and animal well-being, and we're going to trace super briefly evolution in this country and highlighting the significant shifts that have brought us from the 1800s to present day. And this is going to sort of set the stage for an understanding of what we call the human-animal bond and its growing importance in our country. I want to share with you that any of these title slides do have real photos of animals who we have provided care to. Many of these animals were cared by elder individuals in our community, and many of them were experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and this was their primary family member that they brought to seek care from us. And so we're really grateful to be able to share that. What I'm going to ask you to do is when I come to these title slides, just take a few moments and observe the photos. I encourage you to, perhaps take a nice deep breath. We've heard about a lot of really unsettling topics today. This topic is critical and very uncomfortable. And so my hope is that just having a moment to look at these beautiful little faces will give you just a moment of comfort in that nervous system. And notice what comes up for you. Not only, maybe if you happen to be animal like lovers, maybe not just, the initial awe, isn't that really sweet? But notice the coat, notice the temperament, notice the demeanor, maybe the size and maybe breed, or anything else. Any other reflections that you might have? Okay, my friends, super brief history lesson. We know that certain cultures have elevated animals since time memorial, right? If we think about ancient India, emphasized compassion and moral duty towards animals. Ancient Egypt, animals have been revered as sacred and associated with gods, deserving respect and protection. And of course, in our own countries, Indigenous perspectives emphasize honor and respect, the interconnectedness of what we were talking about earlier, of humans and animals and the environment, and really the importance of how we engage with others in our world. That said, the Judeo-Christian tradition largely dismissed animals' needs. And so for centuries, animals were thought to actually lack reasoning, not only reasoning, but also emotion. And we know with Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest that this continued to really reinforce the idea of human domination over animals. This has influenced the way that North American settlers viewed animals for a long period of time. That said, the dominant perspective began to actually shift in the late 1800s with the development in both Canada and the United States, the development of cruelty to animals acts. And so here in Canada, at Toronto Humane Society, there's an individual named John Joseph Kelso, and he was an immigrant to Canada. He grew up him and his family grew up in abject poverty. And through his experiences, he became exposed firsthand, but also to the rest of his community, observed the injustices that were happening to both children and animals alike in Toronto. Following being particularly concerned about the lack of water fountains for what was working horses in Toronto, in 1887, he actually became the founder of Toronto Humane Society. And very quickly, Toronto Humane Society began to provide services not only to working animals, but other strays and other forms of animals that were in Toronto at that time. But the services also were being extended to children. And so ultimately, Kelso actually left Toronto Humane Society 2 years after establishing the society and became the first president of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto. This then started the child welfare movement in our province and subsequently in the country. And this revolutionized child welfare laws for the first time. And when this occurred, then the two industries became siloed. And you'll see on the screen there that photo of that gentleman that's down by City Hall, that gentleman at a water fountain. And you'll see on one side there is a human water fountain, and on the other side that's a water fountain for a horse. And so this is sort of like a symbol of how humans and animals have been intertwined for generations. And while we know that there's been egregious harm that's been caused by both animal welfare and child welfare societies, and that's immeasurable. The original cause for these organizations was really focused on young ones and animals, with the same principles being applied to members of the family, whether you were animal or non-animal. And that the idea that you may be experiencing vulnerability, whether due to violence or age or both, and really primarily the
I think she froze, or is it just my computer?
since this relationships have evolved significantly, and this has really influenced how we view and interact with animals. In Canada, we actually have over 28 million pets compared to 11 million children. So more families have animals than they do children. And we know in North America that children are actually more likely to grow up with a pet than a biological father. And families spend more money on pet food than baby food. We know that children are deeply impacted by their relationships with pets, and that really starts the stage of compassion and awareness of, who we are as individuals and empathy and how we engage with others that we come into contact with. We know that children often learn the name of a family pet right after the name of their caregiver, whether that's mom or dad or sort of whatever that identifier is. And we also know that children will often experience their first moments of grief or loss through death of the family pet. And again, that sets the stage, right, for how was that experience for them, and what do they now understand about death and loss. We know for many in Canada, myself included, pets are considered family, and we've seen this huge evolution of pet parenting, right? It's on the rise. So I don't know if anybody in the audience today has animals with them today. I hope that you do. But we know that people are celebrating their pets' birthdays, that they're dressing them in clothes. We also know that people will decline. Research tells us this. People will actually decline social events because they don't want to leave their pet at home alone. And so as our bond grows with animals, it's really telling us that pets are completely central to how we both express love and receive love and care within our families. The question is why? Why are pets so important to us? And really, it's again, science and research. It tells us what we innately know in our body, and that is that pets are more than companions. They're really vital to our well-being, and they offer us numerous benefits. We know that emotionally, 80% of pet owners, this is Canadian data which I can share with you, find comfort in their pets during lonely moments. 43% of pet owners feel a sense of purpose through the ability to caregive. And this, of course, can reduce that sense of isolation. We know there's tons of research attached to the physical improvements that we can experience in relation to caregiving for animals. We know that pets can reduce stress, blood pressure, improve our heart health. There's a variety of different chronic conditions like diabetes and a variety of types of dementias that can be improved. Some behavioral improvements like improving appetite and other types of, behavioral components to physical illness that can arise. We know socially, pet owners say that the pets help them connect with others. If anybody's been to a dog park, there's oftentimes community within the dog park. And sometimes you want to connect with others that are in that dog park. Sometimes you don't, depending on the dog park. We might end up structuring our days and our lives based on, who we know we're going to see because our pet is friends with one of the other animals that we know that a neighbor or a community member has, right? And so this can really foster a sense of belonging. And by proxy, we know that it can enhance resiliency and recovery and boost well-being overall. So we know that pets can enrich and foster connections and provide unwavering support during challenging times as well, because these benefits are not just when we're doing well, but in fact, they will create improvements in our baseline if things are more challenging. And for all of these reasons, we know that pet guardianship is increasing. There's actually legislative changes in certain countries like France and Portugal and Spain, and they're actually now recognizing animals no longer as property, but in fact as sentient beings and as family members. And so this is this huge legislative shift in how we engage with animals. We're not there yet in Canada, but other countries are leading. So pets can be these protective factors, right? And we know for in later life, it can be even deeper, our bond with animals. So for many older adults, we know that companion animals are incredibly loved and emotionally significant. We know that their pets might have been with them through major life changes, right? Retirements, illnesses, bereavement, perhaps even, loss of independence or autonomy, things of that nature. And so the attachment is something that has perhaps been enduring and has been really stabilizing during a lot of other types of life shifts. And unlike perhaps human relationships that may change over time, we know that the relationship with animals actually continue to give that consistent affection and that consistent connection. And so the emotional bond actually can be a key source of comfort and emotional regulation during these periods of stress or transition. We also know, of course, I mentioned it before, but that idea of loneliness and social isolation, which can be common in later stages of life. And so that daily companionship can really help buffer any of those other types of experiences that might create feelings of isolation. And so the present, right? It's someone to talk to. If you're like me, you might sing to your animal. You might read to your animal, but you're caring and you're engaging and you're interacting with them in really profound ways, often throughout the day, right? And so this companionship obviously can reduce those feelings of isolation and can support improved emotional well-being. Particularly if we have limited social networks or reducing social networks. Oops, my apologies. Um, yeah, so structure and meaning, exactly the same thing, right? Animals will bring structure to our day. The requirement, right? Oftentimes we might get out of bed, maybe not for ourselves. We might not feel like it, but we might do it because we know we've got to get fluffy breakfast, right? Or we've got to get fluffy out. That feeding, that walking, maybe grooming, going, addressing any of those animals' needs will give us some structure to our day, and it can provide that sense of purpose, right? We all need to have feelings of connection and of contribution, and that those experiences of contribution may be through our animals. And so having a pet and being a caretaker to an animal can reinforce our identity and our agency and our meaning, which again might be especially important for somebody who might feel a loss of some of their roles, again through declining health or following retirement, or perhaps they have adult children, that are becoming increasingly autonomous. And so again, having that role and that sense of identity can be really important. And the other thing is that, they might be our sole companion. They might actually also be our link to perhaps a deceased spouse. Maybe we got that animal together, and this is sort of our last link to, somebody else that we shared that animal with. So if we become widowed or we're estranged from family, or socially marginalized, or even just geographically, right? If our kids have moved to other places, this will give us sort of, that continued sense of emotional survival, even. And so animals aren't just seen as extras to people that love them. They're actually essential parts of our adult lives. I have this little video, but I might skip it. I'm going to share it with you because it's actually quite sweet. But it sort of speaks to a lot of the benefits that we might experience from an animal, dressed as almost as if an animal was prescribed like a medication. So I'll share that with you at another time. So, how do we translate what we know about animals in our lives, perhaps? Or maybe we're not animal people, we haven't grown up around them, but why do we want to care about them in our work? Um, and ultimately, the reality is that whether or not we actually care or see the value in animals actually doesn't matter. If they matter to our clients, they have to matter to us, right? So it's really important to understand that pets are health promoting, and they can also present unique barriers for our clients if they're not able to address the needs that they have. And so before I move along, as I promised, just have a quick peek at these beauties. Okay. All right. So the reason that I encourage you to care about animals is essentially animal welfare is connected to every other systemic challenge that people experience. Most of us are probably aware of how a host of other systems, poverty, inequity, these create challenges and barriers to accessing healthy and consistent food and education, job, healthcare, housing, all of these kinds of things. If you have an animal that's attached to that, they're also experiencing all of those challenges and barriers. And unfortunately, there are a lot of systems that we have designed that actually having an animal is a barrier to accessing those supports and services, right? And so, animal welfare is deeply connected to broader systemic challenges. And to address this, we have to raise awareness of the benefits and the barriers to pet ownership and elevate the importance of the bond for our clients and behalf of our clients, because then we can tackle the inequities that exist in them getting the support and services that they need for their animal. What we also know about them being animals being pet promotion agents is also that the inverse is incredibly true. So when individuals are faced with hardship, um, they may feel that hardship even more deeply because they have a dependent that they feel responsible for providing for that perhaps they've been unable to. So we to provide holistic treatment and care for our clients, we actually have to adopt a trans-species perspective because this will ensure that we're providing holistic client-centered care and we're recognizing animals as allies, right, in being able to meet clients' needs. And I'm going to talk briefly about these three primary challenges that our clients might experience. So one is the violence epidemic, of course, challenges for particularly, a more senior population, and then animal care industries, because that is just true. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the concept of the violence link, can anybody just throw thumbs up if you've heard of the violence link before? Okay. So the violence link, thank you so much, everybody. So the violence link isn't a new form of violence. It's actually a way to understand how different forms of harm can occur together, especially within the same household. And so while the bond between a guardian and animal, as I've talked a lot about, is typically one of care, trust, and mutual affection, abuse will fracture this. And so the violence link refers to the connection between violence or neglect towards people in harm, towards people and harm to animals. And so research and practice shows that when abuse is present, it often affects multiple beings, not just one person, right? We know that from our interpersonal violence or, historical domestic violence research that if there is one member of the family that's being harmed, the others are impacted. If they're not physically being impacted, they're certainly being impacted emotionally and what they're bearing witness to, right? We know that research indicates that interpersonal violence and animal abuse rarely occur in isolation. And in fact, there is substantial evidence that links animal abuse to broader patterns of violence, particularly in the context of intimate partner violence, child maltreatment, and of course, elder abuse. And so what we know is that harm caused to animals is both a predictor of and an indicator of interpersonal violence. So when this violence is occurring in one of the domains that you'll see on your screen, it's not typically an isolated incident. Rather, the acts are linked. And so this connection underscores the importance of considering both human and animal victims or survivors when addressing cases or circumstances of abuse and neglect. Why does this matter? Well, for those of us who might be on the front line, so let's say social services or healthcare or law enforcement, animal-related concerns can actually provide early or additional information about risk. So someone may not disclose, as we know, abuse or dangerous situations that are happening for them directly, but they are very likely to talk about any fears that they have for their pet. They might talk about changes in their animal care. They might talk about barriers to being able to access food resources that they previously had no issues in being able to access. They might talk about threats or incidences of injury that an animal has sustained in the home. And these details can be really important indicators of what else might be happening in that environment. And so we actually look at animal abuse as a red flag for human violence, or a sign of potential harm to come. Now, that said, animal cruelty is a crime in and of itself. So we don't want to just think about animal violence as a flag for human violence because we're continuing to, reiterate that hierarchy. However, it is important to think about that any we're going to talk about some of the signs and symptoms that we can look for our animals, but this can alert us to hidden violences in the home when we start to pay attention to those, sort of put on those glasses, if you will. And if we're ignoring animal welfare issues, we're actually missing a huge part of the safety picture that's happening in that home. And what we also know is that households that are marked by IPV actually have higher than average rates of pet ownership. And so these are extremely high risk environments, and they become extremely high risk environments when animal abuse is present. And I'm going to talk about aggressors a little bit for those of you who might work with perpetrators of violence. What I really want to encourage is really looking at animals as not being separate or unrelated. It is really that interconnection between the systems. And we haven't done a great job of being able to help our systems, our animal welfare systems, our law enforcement systems, our healthcare systems of looking at it that way. But I'm hoping that today is sort of a piece of that movement, and the work that you're going to do is going to sort of see how these things are interconnected and interweaved. Again, this is not about turning frontline workers into animal welfare investigators at all. It is just about looking at patterns, asking questions, and understanding risk, maybe a little bit more holistically in terms of trans-species work. Okay, so we're going to talk about elder abuse and safety in later life. And the violence link gives us this broader lens, and it's going to help us understand control and neglect and vulnerability as it shows up in multiple ways. Many of you might be familiar with the power and control wheel. And so traditionally we use this to show how abuse and violence is not just physical harm, but in fact, it's patterns of power and control and coercion. And so the National Link Coalition in the United States has actually adapted the wheel to incorporate the violence link. And what this does is it expands the lens again to include animals so that we can see and notice patterns of control, especially in households with older adults. And what you'll notice is that a ton of the same tactics are going to be very familiar, right? Because what this wheel demonstrates is really just that animal abuse is incorporated into other types of coercive control tactics that are utilized. So we're using threats and intimidation, we're creating fear, we're creating isolation, and we're exerting emotional or psychological control. And the idea is this. The idea is that harm to animals, again, is not random. It is not separate. It doesn't happen by chance. It is actually an intentional act by a perpetrator. So it's intentional, it's strategic, and it's tied directly to controlling and intimidating a person, right? So those emotional attachments that your client might have to companion animals are the heart of the exploitation, are the heart of the method of being able to control and coerce. And so later in life, when animals may be deeply important, this form of control can be especially powerful. What we know is that there's statistically significant differences found in studies that demonstrate that animal abuse not only coexists with, of course, abuse of women particularly, but we also know that individuals will use animals to intimidate and involve children as well, who may try to protect pets and put themselves at risk inadvertently, just by nature. So animals can be used to reinforce coercive control. So a perpetrator might restrict access to food, might restrict access to veterinary care, particularly if they have exerted harm, right? So you made me do this thing. Well, now you have to take the animal to the vet, or I'm not going to let you take the animal to the vet. Denying medications that the animal needs, or blaming, an older adult for maybe naturally resulting end stage of life of that animal. Of course, this will increase feelings of guilt and shame and dependence when an older adult feels responsible for the animal's well-being and perhaps lacks the ability to the power or the resources, really, right, to protect that animal. We hear stories all the time of aggressors who disappear animals, right? So they give them away, they let them out of the house, knowing that they're going to go missing. And this is another form of grief, something that is often known as disenfranchised grief, because we actually don't know what happens to our animal, right? There might be pet-related dependencies. This is a way to control finances, right? And it's all about compliance. We also know that sexual violence, engaging an animal can be used as a form of extreme degradation and control. And so, again, the wheel helps us see patterns, not as isolated incidences, and seeing the potential indicators of broader risk. And then it can remind us again that animals are not side issues. They can actually be central to how power and control is actually operating in the household. The framework is not to assume that abuse is present, right? But it is about awareness that they can be involved in the power and the control. And this can actually deepen vulnerability, right? That said, it can also occur in less dramatic ways. So, it's not uncommon at Toronto Humane Society and other shelter environments that we see people, seniors that might be coerced into relinquishing their animal, perhaps due to reduced ability to provide care for themselves. And we're going to talk about self-neglect a bit as well. For older adults, the loss and the harm of a companion animal can be devastating, and that fear is something that will absolutely keep people in unsafe situations and prevent them from engaging with services. And so the violence link helps us understand behaviors that we might not understand otherwise, right? It's just an animal, or, they're not going to be able to help themselves if they don't leave the animal, things of that nature. But what we know from research is that 1 in 3 Canadian women are going to experience IPV. And that's probably an underreported stat, right? What we know from Canadian data is that 89% of women that were in violence against women shelters reported that animal maltreatment also occurred. So if they had an animal, 89% of those individuals, those animals also experienced maltreatment. 71% of the same population reported that the perpetrators or aggressors harmed, killed, or threatened the animals. So it moved beyond that sense of coercion and moved into physical violence. Over 50% delayed leaving the home environment because they didn't know what they were going to do with their animal if they weren't able to bring it with them. Or they couldn't safely get it out. It gets much more complicated when you have exotics, right? Or livestock. If if the harm is happening on a farm environment or a more rural environment, right? And we know that 1/3 considered returning if they had to leave their animals at home. And what I want to be clear about is that we know survivors are not indecisive, individuals, and their animals are not obstacles. Rather, delayed flight or returning is really about ethical responsibility, right? This delayed is about exercising agency and taking moral responsibility for the animals, right? And so they're not seeing them as not family members, right? They're viewing them as dependents that they have a moral obligation to provide care and safety for. So if your client is refusing shelter or declining intervention or minimizing harm or not letting you into their home, the reality may be that the concern is for an animal, and that might be what's driving those decisions. If your clients are aggressors, something to know is that there are statistically significant differences between animal abusers and non-animal abusers. So of the population of individuals that that have harmed humans, individuals that also harmed animals have specific perspectives and behaviors. They show up as more prevalent. And some of these characteristics are that they typically view an animal as property, not as, something that is maybe more like a family member or a dependent. Often we'll see punishment for things that are unrealistic. So a dog naturally will express itself often through sniffing or chewing or barking. And those things might be punishable, even though that's an animal expressing itself very naturally. They might use animals to release frustration, right? Or, a general sense of objectivity and sort of seeing the animal as being lacking any empathy towards an animal. What we also know is that perpetrators who abuse animals are also more dangerous than perpetrators who do not. So they have higher rates of very extreme rates, symptoms of violence, such as strangulation, sexual violence, and survivors have reported that 80% of them have their own fear of being killed if they have seen their animal being harmed by the perpetrator. So it's really, really critical if we know that animal abuse is happening, the risk of harm in that home, not only is it happening, but the risk of things like strangulation, sexual violence, and ultimate homicide are higher. We also know that there's a concerning link between animal sexual abuse and oftentimes grooming using animal pornography significantly overlaps with abuse um, uh, in related to animal sexual violence. And so a significant proportion of individuals that were involved in animal sexual abuse have histories of sexually offending children or older adults. Um, and as you'll see on the screen, what I mentioned before is that it's not uncommon that individuals that will purport cruelty towards animals might also be engaged in other forms of maladaptive behavior. One thing that's critical to note is that animal cruelty is written into the Criminal Code of Canada. Okay, and so it's important that we talk about legislation. Ontario has some of the strictest animal cruelty laws in Canada, and some of the most severe penalties for neglect or harm. The Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act is the Ministry of the Attorney General, and they set out clear standards for basic care. So things like food, water, shelter, access to veterinary care, access to humane euthanasia when an animal to minimize pain or distress. These are all actually written into the criminal code. And there are specific in provincial animal welfare investigators that will go in and are trained to examine what a situation is that's involving cruelty. They have specialists for livestock, for equines, for horses, as well as for companion animals. And they have the authority to investigate, issue compliance orders. They can seize animals, remove animals, and then they can also lay charges. This act is intended to provide a framework for oversight for public complaints and for animal law enforcement to be able to ensure that there are protections for animals. And again, some of ours are some of the most toughest animal welfare laws in Canada. Um, so, we were talking about ways of just prior. I don't want to mispronounce her name, but our fabulous presenter, was talking about when and how we can report, and that is absolutely critical. We know that we're all bound by our ethical codes, right? I'm not. I know that there's diversity in professions here. Animal cruelty for many of us is not actually reportable. So, as a social worker, um, there are confidentiality is the cornerstone of our practice, as it probably is for many of you in the room today. And I'm actually not permitted to report animal cruelty. Confidentiality supersedes reporting animal cruelty. However, what we know, because we've studied the violence link and learned about the violence link, is that animal maltreatment may not be mandatory. However, if it's connected to risk of harm to a person, then I can utilize that information as a reason or a sign or a symptom of concern. So ethically, animal cruelty or signs of that can be treated as a risk indicator. And so we can actually then proceed with reporting. Clear as mud, probably. But what I would encourage is that, one of the things that we look at when we have animals that come into Toronto Humane Society with non-accidental injuries, meaning intentional harm, is that we will report, social work will get involved, and we will report both to PAWS, the Provincial Animal Welfare, as well as I will contact Children's Aid or, whoever the governing body is. And I will encourage and make sure that I'm linking those two systems who may or may not have already been connected. So it is sort of making sure that we're looking at all members of that family. What I do want you to know is veterinarians, however, are mandated reporters. They must report suspected cases of animal abuse or neglect. So if you are supporting a client in getting veterinary care for your client, you may or may not want to accompany them if you think that there are dynamics that are influencing that animal's care that you think are really important for a veterinarian to be aware of. Unique challenges for seniors. Up to this point, we've really talked about harm to animals, again, that is intentional, where animals are used deliberately, right, as power and control and coercive abuse. But that might not be what you're seeing in your work. You might. But what's also equally important is to pause here and to name that not all harm involving animals is cruelty, especially when we're talking about older adults. Rather, when an older adult is no longer able to care for a pet as they once did, it can actually reflect shared vulnerability, control by another person, again, or unmet support needs. And so this brings us to a really important distinction, which is capacity versus cruelty. And some situations, what looks like neglect or harm may actually reflect changes in that person's physical health, their cognitive capacity, their mobility, their income, or access to support. And this is not intentional acts of suffering or harm. And so, as frontline providers or responders, how we interpret what we're seeing really, really matters. If we approach every situation, every concern through a cruelty lens, we're going to risk mislabeling the situations, right? If we even see it at all. But then we're also going to miss opportunities to support the human, right? In that home. And so we know that many older adults deeply care about their animals. And when the animal's condition starts to decline, we know that sometimes our senior people have senior animals. And so senior animals, like humans, sometimes need more visits with the vet, right? When the animal's conditions might start to deteriorate, and this can be really stressful for owners across the board, right? And so oftentimes there is an issue of capacity, not a lack of concern or lack of care. They might have difficulty lifting really big bags of food, right? And so instead they're getting small cans here and there, and it might look like they don't have sufficient amount of food. Or kitty litter, my gosh, how heavy is kitty litter? They might have trouble remembering medications if their animal is on medications, and that can have really dire impacts for that animal. Um, or if there's chronic conditions that the animal is experiencing, right? That can be really difficult. And so we want to look for the signs of shared vulnerability, where the well-being of the person and the animals are actually closely tied together, and they might actually both be affected by aging or illness or income security issues or isolation. And so, are we seeing cruelty or are we seeing capacity challenges that require support rather than enforcement? And we're not wanting to minimize animal suffering in any regard. It's not about ignoring the risk, but it is about how we approach or respond more accurately, compassionately, and ultimately more effectively, right, in the work that we're doing. So we can see often what we will see is that if there are signs that are new or different for an animal, let's say matting that never happened before, or really long nails that never happened before, this might be much more of an indication of self-neglect that's happening within the home. Um, Maybe this is about the clients having difficulty providing care for themselves, and it's perhaps showing itself first in the animal state. Sometimes it might be a matter of transportation, right? Of the person being able to actually get the pet to the vet, particularly if the animal has some behavioral challenges. If it's like, an old animal that's painful, it might not let that person pick it up and put it in a carrier and go on transit and do all those other things. One situation two things I want to mention. So one is another difficulty that we see very frequently is denial of service. And so this is when adults might have the right care providers on their healthcare team. However, those home healthcare aides might be reluctant to enter a home if there are animals. And there might be very legitimate reasons for that. It might be, the presence of an aggressive animal. It might be that, the situation has sort of gotten to an untenable or an inhabitable situation and people don't feel comfortable going in. If the animal, let's say there's mobility issues and the animal needs to be taken out and the person is not able to take that animal out for walks, the animal, of course, is going to, go to the bathroom inside. And so there might be situations like that we can go, oh, that's not just a gross situation. That's telling me something else that's happening. But we do see that reluctance to enter a senior's home, particularly if we are community-based, is a really big barrier for people where they're having to choose that pet that's been with them for, let's say a decade, or the healthcare PSW support that they might need. Another situation that I do want to raise is animal hoarding. And we know, right, that this is a very complex mental health condition. And this is when we accumulate a huge number of animals, or just a number of animals that you're unable to provide care for. And what results is actually very unhealthy conditions for both the humans and the animals. And hoarding behavior is typically linked, right, to underlying mental health issues. It's not typically that people hoard just animals. But it does require a coordinated multi-agency approach. And unfortunately, animal hoarding, often happens because of lack of access to spay and neuter services. So somebody, might be very well intentioned, but the situation gets out of control very quickly, and they become overwhelmed. Unfortunately, it is one of the most egregious circumstances of cruelty that can happen because of the inbreeding and the subsequent genetic deformities that can result from this. So if you're noticing large amounts of animals, please, 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 engage whoever your local animal experts are on how to approach that. Because we don't want to just remove all the animals necessarily. That might be required for a period of time. However, they got the animals in the first place because they loved the animals, right? There are also health, safety, and social implications that can speak to vulnerabilities. If there are, zoonotic diseases, as you can see on the screen, those are essentially diseases that can pass, or illnesses that can pass between a human and an animal. And so particularly for our older adults that might be vulnerable to chronic health conditions, or they might have weakened immunity or immune systems, the conditions, they might be acquiring illness from their animal, particularly if they're living in unsanitary living conditions, because this can increase the risk of zoonotic disease. That can happen for a host of different reasons. Often it's declining capacity, mobility issues, lack of support. We know that animals, unfortunately, in their care needs can increase fall risks, right? So if an animal is underfoot really quickly, or clutter, if there's pet supplies everywhere or many places, and then difficulty managing an animal. If you walk your animal and then all of a sudden, you have an injury, how are you going to get that animal out all the time? So falls, we know, are a major cause of injury in older adults, and so environmental risks can have some serious consequence. We also know that older adults will often share, if they are unlimited resources, they might share their food resources with animals, right? Or they might prioritize that animal over their own needs. And of course, this can create malnutrition or food insecurity issues for the pet, but for them, right? And often, this sharing of food is really about deep attachment and responsibility, and it's not poor judgment at all. It really just shows that the animal is very important to them. People might start to also withdraw from services if they fear that their circumstance is getting, they're struggling to look after that animal or themselves. So they might actually increase their isolation because they might be worried that we're going to suggest that they can't care for their animal anymore. And another risk that we see is end of life. Right. So bereavement is a critical factor for older adults. They might be grieving, of course, a lifetime worth of grief. And being faced with end of life of your pet can have profound emotional impact. So how are we supporting our older adults in that goodbye process, right? Because we know that type of a loss can actually really intensify vulnerability for the person. And so just sort of thinking that there are a host of different ways that our clients might be impacted by their relationship with their animal. And there's a host of, these might be risks, but there's a lot of things that we can put in place to help maintain that human-animal bond. I'm going to send you this slide. This is just a little bit of a quick peek at some of the things that you can look at. As you'll see along the top, the different colors, you'll see animals need, to have their hunger and thirst addressed. They need to have pain and injury, and they need to be free from pain, injury, and disease. Also, fear from distress. They need to be able to move around and express themselves normally. And they need to be stimulated in not just ways that are physical, but mentally stimulated and things of that nature. And so this chart might be a bit of a prompt for you to sort of see where the animals in your client's cares are falling. If they're able to meet, all of those needs, most of the time, then they're doing an incredible job of providing an incredible life for that animal. And if they're further down on the scale, it doesn't mean that it's not because they don't want to, but it might signal that maybe there's something we can do to help support, elevate that improvement in the animal's life, and in the person's life, because we know that people are incredibly stressed and feel a tremendous amount of guilt if they're finding themselves lower and lower on that scale. They're very worried about it as well. What I also want to share very quickly is people might not know, but veterinary care, there's no social health for veterinary care in our country. And so veterinary professionals are working in private clinics or corporate clinics or things of that nature. And so when we get an animal, we don't always realize that the cost might be much, much higher than we anticipate. And in our industry, with inflation, rates of technology and medications and food supplies are just going up and up and up. So there's actually a crisis that's happening in veterinary care and animal care in general, where there's a tremendous amount of shortage of veterinarians and spay neuter. So even if you have and access to spay neuter, so even if you have financial resources and you can get into a vet appointment, even if you have financial resources, you may not actually be able to get a veterinary appointment because a lot of veterinarians are not taking new clients, not dissimilar to family healthcare teams, right? So things to think about is that there might be other systemic issues in the animal care industry that are interrupting. I would encourage you highly to connect with your humane societies or rescue organizations in your communities, because they, like us, might offer low-cost subsidized veterinary care that is accessible and affordable. And going to be able to, help your clients in ways that they can manage both what's in front of them as a family, but also manage the animal care crisis that we're experiencing. Because we know the most frequent barrier for people being able to access veterinary care is affordability. Behind that is food insecurity, pet food insecurity, and then grooming issues, right? So those really long overgrown nails and welfare grooms, matting. We might think that it's an aesthetic, but it isn't. When those nails are really long, they're not able to move around freely. Or if we have severe matting, what it does is, if you've ever had a mat in your hair, it will continue to accumulate and start to pull the skin. And then you'll get ulcerations, lacerations, things of that nature that then, ultimately what can happen is the hair might start to collect around, let's say, a limb, and then it might actually constrain the blood flow, and then you're having appendages that are actually dying and becomes deceased. So it is a very, very important issue that we can talk to our clients about. So if your clients have pets, it's really important to understand the lengths that they're going to go for their animals. But what we know is that they probably will compromise their health to be able to care for the animal. They might stay in dangerous situations, and they might actually feel forced to surrender their animal or elect for euthanasia if they feel like they can't care for that animal from a financial lens. And we don't want that. We want to help you move into implementation. We want to help you be able to highlight some of the ways that we can help you. Again, these slides will be shared, but some basic questions. Ask about the animal in their lives, right? It might seem really obvious, but you may or may not be doing it. Do they have pets now? Have they had them in the past? What kinds of needs does their pet have? How can we assist them in caring for their pet? Keep it as a living conversation. It's not a checkbox and a one-off, because that animal is going to change. Their care needs are going to change. So ask again, how is Fluffy doing since the last time we were together? Has anything changed? Is anything getting in the way of you being able to provide supports and services for your animal? You might also want to ask, what does your animal mean to you? Or how does your animal help you? What would happen if you no longer had your animal? You're going to get some really, 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 really important information about your client, their attachment, and gaps potentially that are there. Tell me about an animal's typical day. They might not tell you about their typical day, but they're going to tell you about from the time they wake up to the time they and Fluffy go to bed, everything in between. If we're specifically concerned about violence, do you have a concern for the safety or well-being of your animal? You may also want to ask something like, what is somebody else in your family? What's their attitude towards the pet? So what is your family member's attitude towards your pet? Oh, they don't care about them, or, oh, they think they're a nuisance, or they never wanted me to get pets anyway, right? Has your pet ever been unable or prevented from going outside or accessing basic needs? Might tell you something. Also, normalizing it. We sometimes hear that when an owner is in an unsafe environment, their animal has been threatened or injured. Has something like this ever happened before? Normalize that this is very common. When you go into homes, I would encourage you to think about the animal's condition. Again, their, nails, matting, eyesight. Right? Do they seem to be getting around okay? How's their hearing? How's their mobility? Because a lot of people will make changes for their animal. The other thing is if people smoke, a lot of people smoke inside, particularly. Research says that a lot of people will reduce harms for their animal before they'll reduce harms for themselves. So they might choose to not smoke inside if they know that is harming their animal, right? There's all of these nuances, right? Let's say that they are perhaps overweight and their pet is overweight. You can have a conversation with them about Fluffy's diet and the nutrition that they're providing, and how are they being able to, is there something that they can mirror within themselves? Look for injuries, look for multiple animals. The third thing there, if somebody's mentioning that animals are that there's repetitive deaths in the home, that is a huge flag that something abnormal is happening. If it doesn't seem to be, that there was an unexpected infection of a litter or something like that. Look for odors and excrement. You probably can't ignore them because they might, hit you in the face, but what do you do with that next, right? And then look for behavioral conditions. How does the animal behave when you're around? Is it cowering? That might just be the animal's temperament, or it might be something else. I would encourage you to look into resources in your community, low-cost pet food supplies, low-cost medical services or care, grooming options, training options. Um, Pet-friendly shelters, right, or housing, look into places that will co-shelter. Alternatively, there are programs where you can enroll your animal into a foster program. We have a program such as this, where let's say somebody is going into the hospital and they are socially isolated and have financial constraints. We'll bring the animal in for temporary fostering, and when they are, things have stabilized, the animal goes home with them, rather than having to surrender their animal. Real basic things like automatic kitty litters, automatic pet feeders. These are great tools and strategies that can really help people stay with their animals. There's a wonderful organization called Elder Dog. They're a national organization. They work primarily with individuals that are seniors and have animals, and they'll help you create care plans around, do you need support walking your dog? They're going to set you up with a volunteer to come and have that dog walked, or, cleaning litter, or making sure that you can get those heavy, bags of litter to your home, things of that nature. They do remarkable work. Please look them up. At Toronto Humane Society, if you are Toronto based, we have things like our pet food bank, we have our foster care program, we have grief and bereavement when the time comes that the animal is no longer in your life. We do pop-up clinics. So if you're a care facility, we'll come to, and you have a bunch of animals, your clients have animals, we'll come to you and we'll vaccinate on site. We also have supplies. So as organizations, you can sign up and we sort of like online shopping, you'll pick the supplies that you want and you need, come and pick them up from us, and they're all free so that you can then dole out the supplies that you know that your clients need. And then we also have a training for anybody that does co-sheltering or invites animals into your spaces. We don't assume that you know how to read an animal's body language. We don't assume that you know all the legislation that is related to having animals or the medical care, but we can harness you with that information so that you can then download it to your clients. Two other things that you might want to think about. Quality of life scales are really important documents for end of life planning with your clients. They may not want to think about end of life for themselves or for their animal, but it's really important that they do. We know that research says that more people regret not euthanizing sooner and actually extending an animal's life beyond, they feel regret about extending the painfulness that they know their animal was experiencing, also including animals in their wills and in their, plans for when they depart, if their animal's going to outlive them. And then the other thing is we do have a document. You can scan the QR code or I can circulate it later, but thinking about emergency care. What happens when somebody ends up in the hospital? We're all going to end up in the hospital or in a situation where we can't look after our animal. Best to have a plan beforehand. And another thing is animals can be included in restraining orders. So if there are safety issues, you can include animals in restraining orders. My takeaways for you, my friends: pets can be protective. They can also create vulnerability factors in your clients. Animal abuse can be a sign, a signal, a predictor of future violence. Screening can be simple. Ask about the animal. You're going to get so much more info. And collaboration really can save lives, both animal both human and non-human. And I think we're at time. Am I right?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you.
But we do have a couple questions. We do have a few minutes just to
Ah,
ask some questions. I know the first question that came in early was around housing. So a lot of times seniors may have to move, but there's limitations on people moving with pets, particularly depending on which residence that they may be going to. Has there any advocacy or movement on some of the policies that should allow for animals to continue to live with older adults? I don't know if you're aware of that
that's a
or
really big question. What we should know, if you do not know, is that Ontario is one of the very few provinces that doesn't have any restrictions from standard housing. So a landlord cannot prevent anybody from getting housing because they have an animal. You do not have to disclose if you have an animal. There are exceptions to that if it is a care facility, a transitional facility, long-term care, or condos. Condos make kind of their own rules. Um, or if your animal is a safety risk, like if it's, if you move in and then there starts to be safety risks, they do have the right to have safe environments. Um, so I think what I would suggest is making sure that you and your clients are familiar with legal protections that you have. A landlord cannot decline based on having an animal and cannot evict simply on having an animal. In this question, if the person wants to clarify, was there a specific form of housing that they were asking about? Whether it was
uh,
shelter or market rent
no,
or,
it wasn't that specific.
okay. If they want to clarify, I might be able to speak to it, but from market rent, it is really important to know that our province has that protection.
Okay, thank you. And I think you answered this around the connection between animal hoarding and violence. And okay, so is there a connection between animal hoarding and violence? Is there other forms of animal abuse as mentioned in your presentation? You kind of alluded to some of that hoarding.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat that? Is there a connection between other forms of animal violence and other
Animal
forms of
hoarding and animal hoarding and violence as there is with other forms of animal abuse.
I gotcha. I gotcha. Um, you know what? I don't know offhand. I don't know. I don't want to speak to something that I don't know. What I will say anecdotally and what we see in our shelter is no. That typically it is overwhelmed caregivers. Typically, these are people that are incredibly caring and things get out of control rather quickly, often because there isn't finances to be able to spay neuter. Or sometimes there's not an awareness that animals from the same litter, like brothers and sisters, will mate. Sometimes people think that they won't, but they in fact will. So from my experience, I haven't seen that. However, there is a correlation between breeding. Let's say dogs this is illegal in Ontario. Actually, yeah, legal in our country is dog fighting, but there is correlation between breeding animals for dogfighting purposes and often other forms of criminality.
Thank
So
you.
I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but we haven't seen overwhelmed caregivers. Typically, it's an internal experience where it's oftentimes something that's happening, a mental health condition that's happening for them, in addition to this pervasive love of animals.
So just to clarify in that housing, somebody had mentioned about moving. So what do you do when shelters won't allow pets?
So we're making great strides in Ontario to have many, many more shelters permitting animals. So I really need to champion that industry. Women's Shelter Canada is working really hard to make our VAW shelters pet friendly and has a plan to do that nationally. So for that specific population, it's coming. Um, I would say raise the issue and say that this is a barrier, right? All of our shelters housing is a human right, and no barrier housing is absolutely critical. No barrier means you come with what you have, right? And what you have is your animal. That said, shelters sometimes have difficulties or real legitimate reasons for having concerns, whether that's safety, whether that's resources, things of that nature. But if you connect with your organizations like your humane societies, like Toronto Humane Society, for example, we can help meet those needs. And I see Jackie. Jackie, you're on the call. How fabulous that you're here. Yes, Jackie just flagged that we do have a Canadian working group, and we are working. Our mandate really is to increase, exactly like Jackie says, pet inclusivity in all types of housing across Canada. So there's a lot of work that's going behind the scenes, but also just call your shelters. I mean, I find a lot of success when I help support. Unfortunately, sometimes our clients need our voice in conjunction with their own to do that advocacy piece, right? Or look for pet safekeeping programs that can temporary shelter, or call your private veterinarians and say, I've got this situation, I need your help. The other thing, Victim Services Toronto, we work with them a lot. They sometimes have funding that they can apply to for your clients that are fleeing violence for animal care if they've experienced injuries as a result of the violence, but also for temporary boarding purposes. Yeah, that's what I would
That's
say.
great. Thank you
Hi,
so much.
Jackie.
I appreciate that. And there was somebody else just also mentioning it. Peterborough Humane Society has a SUNY program, which so I encourage people to reach out to their local shelters because they may be called something different, but they may all have the same purpose and goal. And I appreciate your presentation. I think it's sort of everything's flowing so naturally because when Denise was talking about threat assessments and she did bring in pets. And it just talks about that risk factors and the questions that you asked at the end for us to, as providers, to ask the clients about the pet safety, because sometimes we don't, Fluffy might be there, but we don't ask questions about the interaction, whether that's their relationship, their ability the challenges to cope, but also with that perpetrator. So I do appreciate bringing that to light and kind of coming full circle. So thank you so much, Dylan. It was a pleasure having you today, bringing this to light, and this may not be the only session that we may bring you back again, just to maybe get more into some of the nuances that we kind of just touched on today. So thank you so much for your presentation. And again, just to let everyone know that we will be posting the links to the resources that Dylan had provided in our website after the presentation. So thank you so much. I appreciate you attending today.